The whole town laughed when he built it that high, and now they understand why. A weather-worn veteran in a red and black flannel moved to the edge of Spokane, Washington, chasing quiet and one last winter of peace. But when the first brutal storm hit, his loyal German shepherd refused to leave the ladder, barking into the wind as the temperature collapsed and the power went out across the valley. What the neighbors mocked as madness became the only fire that never went out. And when desperate knocks began echoing through the snow-packed night, a simple idea built on a rooftop would decide who survived the winter and who didn't. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always powerful to see how far these stories of survival and quiet courage can reach. Winter reached Spokane ahead of schedule. The first snow falling before October could finish its last week. Wind scouring the pine-lined hills like a warning that no one asked for. Walter Hayes felt it in his bones before he saw it in the sky. That old familiar tightening in his knees and shoulders. The kind of quiet ache that never lied. He stood on the frozen ground beside his small log house on the northern ridge, a place once used as a training outpost decades ago, and looked up at the roof as if measuring something no one else could see. Walter was 73, tall but slightly stooped, his frame lean from years of rationed meals and deliberate movement. His face was cut sharp and angular, cheekbones pronounced, jaw squared by time rather than muscle, and a gray-white beard clung close to his skin, trimmed not for style but to keep ice from forming in it. Deep lines ran from his eyes to the corners of his mouth, marks left not by laughter, but by squinting into wind, sun, and distant horizons. He wore the same thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket he had worn for years, its elbows patched twice over, the fabric stiff with old smoke and sap. It was not nostalgia that kept him wearing it. It was memory, discipline, and a belief that if something still worked, it deserved respect. Below him sat Shadow, his German shepherd, nearly 10 years old now. The black saddle on his back faded into gray, the tan of his legs dulled by age. Shadow's ears no longer snapped up at every sound, but his amber eyes remained sharp, tracking Walter's movements with the steady patience of a soldier who had learned to wait. The dog's muzzle was dusted with white, and his gait had slowed. But when he sat at the foot of the ladder, his posture was alert, spine straight, tail resting on the snow as if standing watch. Shadow had been with Walter since his last year of service, acquired not through ceremony but necessity after an explosion who took the hearing of the handler who once held the leash. Walter never talked about that day, but Shadow remembered it in ways humans could not see. The laughter began quietly at first. A pickup slowed on the gravel road below the ridge, the driver leaning out to stare at the tall wooden frame Walter had started raising above his roofline. By the third day, the laughter had grown louder, carried uphill from the town's only tavern, where men gathered early once the cold came. They said the old veteran had finally cracked, that he was building a coffin for himself on top of his own house. Someone named it the rooftop grave. Someone else called it the skybox. The name that stuck, though, was simpler and crueler: the wooden mistake. Walter heard none of it directly. He didn't go to town unless he had to, and when he did, he kept his eyes forward, his words few. Years earlier, something had closed inside him after his wife died, and his only son moved east and stopped calling. Silence had become not a wound, but a tool, a way to conserve what little energy he had left. Walter worked methodically. Each morning he climbed the ladder, Shadow watching from below, and laid another plank, another brace, another careful joint sealed against wind. The structure was narrow but tall, rising higher than the chimney, angled just enough to shed snow but enclosed tightly on all sides. He measured twice, cut once, and tested every beam with his full weight before trusting it. His hands were thick and scarred, nails split, knuckles swollen, but steady. The cold numbed pain quickly. He preferred it that way. Pain reminded him he was still here. Numbness reminded him to keep moving. On the fourth afternoon, a woman stopped at the base of the ridge. Her name was Sarah Collins, though Walter didn't know it yet. She was in her late 40s, tall and slender, with pale skin weathered by wind and long hours outdoors. Her brown hair was streaked with premature gray and pulled into a loose braid that slipped over her shoulder. She wore a heavy coat that didn't quite fit right, the kind borrowed or bought secondhand, and gloves too thin for the cold. Sarah taught at the local elementary school and lived alone after her husband left years earlier. She had learned to observe quietly, to speak carefully, and to recognize loneliness in others even when it wore armor. She stood watching Walter for several minutes before calling out, her voice respectful, uncertain. "You need help with that ladder?" Walter paused, looked down once, then shook his head. "I've got it," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Sarah nodded, hesitated, then said, "They're laughing in town." Walter gave a short shrug. "They laughed before," he replied, and climbed another rung. Sarah stayed long enough to see Shadow shift his position to keep the ladder steady with his body. Then she left without another word, her concern settling quietly into her chest. That night, as the temperature dropped hard and fast, Walter sat by his small stove, Shadow curled nearby, and thought about the first winter after he moved there. The memory came uninvited, sharp as frost. He remembered stacking firewood neatly under a tarp, confident it would hold. He remembered waking to sleet, then rain, then cold again. He remembered the sound his axe made when it struck a log that had gone soft with moisture, the dull thud instead of the clean crack. He remembered the stove dying in the middle of the night, Shadow whining softly, breath fogging the air. He had burned a chair that night, then a shelf. He had promised himself never again. In war, mistakes cost lives immediately. In winter, they took their time. The next morning, the first real storm rolled over Spokane's northern ridge. Snow fell heavy and wet, plastering itself to every surface. Walter stood under the half-finished structure, watching how the snow slid off the angled roof just as he had planned. He smiled once briefly, the expression unfamiliar on his face. Below him, Shadow barked once, sharp and approving, then settled back into his silent watch. Down in town, the laughter continued, louder now, fueled by whiskey and certainty. But up on the ridge, nail by nail, beam by beam, something else was being built. Not defiance, not pride, preparation. Walter drove the last nail just as dusk bled into the snow-heavy sky. He climbed down slowly, joints stiff, breath controlled. Shadow stood, tail wagging once, restrained but present. Walter rested a hand on the dog's broad head, fingers sinking into thick fur. "We'll be ready," he said, not to the dog, but to the winter itself. Above them, the strange wooden structure stood tall against the darkening sky. Quiet, patient, waiting for the season to prove a point no one in town yet understood. The snow did not stop after the first storm. It settled in layer after layer, as if Spokane itself had decided to test who belonged and who did not. Walter Hayes woke before dawn each morning, long before light reached the ridge. the habit carved into him decades ago when sleep came in short, guarded stretches. His breath fogged the cabin air as he sat on the edge of the bed, boots already placed where his hands could find them in the dark. Shadow stirred at his feet, joints stiff, rising slowly with a low huff that carried neither complaint nor weakness, only age. The dog's fur had thickened for winter, coarse along the spine, softer at the neck, where Walter's fingers often rested when thought grew heavy. Outside, the wind worried at the trees, testing their roots the way it tested men. Walter listened to it with the same attention he once gave artillery fire, not with fear, but with calculation. He had learned long ago that cold itself was not the enemy. Cold was honest. It announced itself plainly. What killed men quietly was moisture trapped where it didn't belong, and wind that stole heat faster than the body could replace it. In the Army Corps of Engineers, Walter had been trained to build fast and right under pressure, bridges that had to hold before dawn, shelters that could not fail even once. He had been younger then, broader in the shoulders, his beard dark and thick, his confidence reinforced daily by the presence of men who relied on him without question. The event that shaped him most had not been a battle, but a winter exercise in the northern Rockies, when a temporary encampment failed because someone stacked firewood too close to the ground. The snow melted slightly during the day, refroze at night, and soaked the logs from the bottom up. A man named Daniel Price, quiet, competent, newly married, took the late watch that night. By morning, the stove was cold. Price was dead, his body stiff beside damp wood that would not catch. Walter had been the one ordered to inspect the site. He never forgot the smell of wet bark or the sound of silence where a man's breathing should have been. That lesson followed him home long after the uniform was folded away. When he moved to Spokane, seeking distance from people and memories alike, he believed his knowledge would be enough. The first winter corrected that belief. He had stacked his firewood neatly under the eaves, wrapped it in heavy tarps weighted with stones, confident in old habits. Then came freezing rain, then wind that tore the tarp loose like paper. Snow crept in sideways, melting just enough to soak the logs before the temperature plunged. Walter remembered that night clearly now as he poured coffee into a chipped mug and stared at the stove. Shadow had been restless, pacing, nails clicking softly against the floor. The fire sputtered, then failed. Walter tried log after log, each one hissing uselessly. In the end, he broke a chair with the blunt end of an axe, then fed the stove with shelves he had built himself. He told no one. Shame was a quiet thing, but it burned. By mid-November of this second winter, the rooftop structure was complete. Walter climbed the ladder daily, testing the hatch, checking for leaks, sealing seams with tar and resin he mixed himself. The interior stayed dry, even as snow piled against the sides. He stacked split pine and cedar carefully, each log placed with space enough to breathe, elevated above moisture, protected from wind. Shadow followed him up the ladder as far as the dog could manage, then waited below, head tilted upward, ears pricked. Walter trusted that watch more than his own balance some days. News traveled slowly but steadily down the ridge. The same laughter that had followed Walter's work shifted into curiosity as the cold deepened. One afternoon, a man trudged up the slope, boots crunching loudly enough to announce his presence long before he spoke. His name was Tom Miller, a mechanic in his late 50s, stocky, with a thick neck and a beard that grew wild when winter came. His hands were permanently stained with grease and the skin cracked and red from years of cold metal and chemical cleaners. Tom had a reputation for being loud, dismissive, and certain of his own competence. A man who laughed first and reconsidered later. He stopped at the base of the ladder and looked up, squinting. "That thing still holding?" he called. Walter didn't answer right away. He finished tightening a bolt, climbed down slowly, and met Tom's gaze. "So far," he said. Tom snorted. "Looks like overkill." Walter nodded once. "Winter doesn't care." Tom lingered longer than he intended. He noticed the warmth coming from the chimney, steady and unbroken, even as the wind sharpened. He noticed Shadow lying calmly near the stove, visible through the open door, eyes half closed, not shivering. Tom said nothing more that day, but he left quieter than he arrived. Sarah Collins returned too, a week later, climbing the ridge with a careful gait that suggested she was not used to uneven ground. The cold had reddened her cheeks, and her hair escaped its braid in wisps that caught the light. She brought a small paper bag with her, apples and a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "I thought you might need these, Joan," she said, holding them out without stepping too close. Walter hesitated, then took them, nodding. Sarah glanced at the structure above the roof, her eyes tracing its shape. "My students talk about it," she said. "Some of them laugh, some of them ask questions." Walter allowed himself a thin smile. "Questions are better," he replied. Sarah agreed. Before leaving, she crouched to greet Shadow, who accepted her touch politely, sniffing her gloves and then settling again, satisfied. As December closed in, the first real test arrived. A storm swept across the region with little warning, heavy snow driven by sustained winds that rattled windows and bent young trees. Power went out across large parts of Spokane. Down in town, heaters failed and generators sputtered. On the ridge, Walter's stove burned steadily. He climbed to the hatch and pulled down dry logs, each one catching easily, the flame strong and clean. Shadow slept deeply, curled close enough to feel the heat without crowding it. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the air remained calm. Late on the second night of the storm, someone knocked. Walter opened the door to find Tom Miller standing there, his bravado stripped away by cold. His beard was crusted with ice, his coat stiff, his eyes red-rimmed. "My wood's soaked," Tom said, not meeting Walter's eyes. "I thought I had time." Walter studied him for a moment, then stepped aside to let him feel the warmth. "Bring something to trade tomorrow," Walter said evenly. "We'll talk." Tom nodded, relief washing over his face, and left without argument. Walter closed the door and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He felt only the heavy clarity that came when old lessons proved themselves again. Shadow rose and pressed his side against Walter's leg, a solid, familiar weight. Walter rested his hand on the dog's head and looked toward the ceiling, toward the dry wood waiting above. He knew this was only the beginning. Winter had not finished asking its questions yet. January arrived without ceremony and without mercy. The sky over Spokane darkened into a low, unbroken lid of iron-gray cloud, and the air grew sharp enough to sting exposed skin within seconds. What began as freezing rain turned into sleet, then into heavy, compacted snow that fell relentlessly for hours, each layer pressing down harder than the last. Roads vanished first, then fences, then the familiar shapes of sheds and woodpiles that had once looked solid and dependable. Power lines sagged and snapped under the weight. By the second night, most of the northern ridge lay silent and dark, the temperature plunging well past -20 Celsius, cold enough to turn breath into crystals and sound into something brittle. Walter Hayes watched it all from his window, unmoving, a mug of weak coffee cooling in his hands. His face remained calm, but inside him something tightened with the old, disciplined focus he remembered from deployments long past. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt confirmation. The rooftop storage above him groaned once under the wind, then settled, its angled roof shedding snow exactly as he had designed it to. Inside the cabin, the stove burned steady and sure. When he climbed the ladder and opened the ceiling hatch, the air that spilled down smelled of dry pine and cedar, sharp and clean. The logs came down crisp, almost light in his hands, and the fire answered immediately, flaring bright orange as if grateful. Shadow lay stretched beside the hearth, his aging body relaxed, ribs rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. The dog's ears twitched occasionally at distant sounds, trees splitting, metal shrieking somewhere down the ridge, but he did not rise. He trusted the fire, and he trusted the man who had built it into certainty. Down the hill, certainty unraveled quickly. Lean-tos collapsed under the weight of ice-laden snow. Tarps tore loose and flapped themselves to rags. Firewood stacked carefully back in October turned dark and spongy, hissing uselessly when thrown into stoves. People burned cardboard first, then furniture, then anything that would fit through a stove door. The laughter that had once followed Walter's work did not vanish all at once. It thinned, faltered, and finally died somewhere between the second and third night of the storm. The knock came late, well past midnight, when the wind had settled into a constant, punishing howl. Walter opened the door to find Tom Miller standing rigid in the snow, shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Tom looked smaller than Walter remembered, his stocky build diminished by exhaustion and cold. His beard was clotted with ice, and the bravado that usually defined his face had been scrubbed away, leaving behind something raw and frightened. "My stove went out," Tom said, voice hoarse. "Everything I had. It's soaked through." He did not meet Walter's eyes. Walter glanced once toward the ladder, then back at Tom. "What did you bring?" he asked quietly. Tom swallowed, nodded toward the sack slung over his shoulder. "Canned food, some tools, whatever you need." Walter stepped aside and let the heat roll out into the night. Tom stood there for a moment longer, absorbing it, before nodding his thanks and leaving again, his footsteps heavier on the return path. By morning, others followed. Not all at once, not as a crowd, but singly, reluctantly, each one carrying the weight of having been wrong. One was a man named Rick Dalton, tall and broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a habit of standing too close when he spoke, a former mill worker whose temper had cost him more than one job. Rick arrived with frost-bitten fingertips and a jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out sharply beneath his skin. He did not ask politely. "I know you've got dry wood," he said, eyes flicking upward toward the roof. Walter did not step back. He stood straight, shoulders squared beneath his flannel, gaze steady. Shadow rose at his side, not growling, not barking, simply present, amber eyes locked on Rick's movements. The silence stretched. Rick looked at the dog, then at Walter, and finally exhaled hard. "I'll trade," he muttered. Walter nodded once. Rick left, returning an hour later with planks torn from his own shed, pride splintered along with the wood. Sarah Collins came in daylight, her face pale beneath her scarf, worry etched deeply around her eyes. She had walked up the ridge instead of driving, knowing the roads were impassable. Her fingers were red and cracked, and she moved stiffly, unused to such cold. "The school gym's being used as a shelter," she said quietly. "Some of the kids, their families ran out of fuel last night." Walter listened without interrupting. He did not promise more than he could give. "Tell them to bring something to burn," he said. "Even broken things." Sarah nodded, relief softening her expression. She reached down to touch Shadow's head, her hand trembling slightly. "You planned for this," she said. Walter shook his head. "I prepared," he replied. "That's different." As the third night fell, the storm worsened. Snow fell so thick it erased depth and distance, turning the world into a narrow tunnel of white. The temperature dropped further, the kind of cold that made even well-sealed doors creak and complain. Walter climbed the ladder again, slower this time, joints aching, breath controlled. When he reached into the storage space, he felt the difference immediately. The stack had sunk. Where it had once reached his elbow, it now barely brushed his wrist. He stood there longer than usual, hand resting on the logs, counting without counting. Shadow barked softly from below, a single sharp sound that echoed in the tight space. Walter closed the hatch and descended, his face unreadable. That night, Rick returned, along with a woman Walter had never met. Her name was Elaine Foster, slight and hollow-cheeked, wrapped in layers that did not quite hide how thin she was. Her hair was cropped short, unevenly, as if cut without a mirror. She held a bundle close to her chest. Her cat, a small gray thing with wide, frightened eyes and frost-dusted whiskers. "My heater broke," Elaine said, voice barely above a whisper. "I've got old doors, fence boards, anything." Walter took the boards, stacked them near the stove, and showed her how to feed the fire properly. The cat hissed at the unfamiliar smells, then settled against the warmth, purring weakly. By dawn, the ridge had changed. Smoke rose steadily from Walter's chimney, a thin, unwavering line against the pale sky. Other houses lay dark and silent, their chimneys cold. Word spread without words. People stopped laughing because laughter required energy they no longer had. They spoke quietly now, voices measured, movements careful. Walter did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man watching resources dwindle and knowing that winter was far from finished. That afternoon, Walter sat alone at the table, hands wrapped around a mug that no longer held coffee. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes half open. Outside, the wind eased for the first time in days, an unsettling calm that promised nothing good. Walter looked up toward the ceiling, toward the wood that remained, and understood with a clarity that left no room for comfort. He would have to choose carefully who received warmth and who would have to find it elsewhere. The storm had silenced the laughter. Now it demanded decisions. The storm loosened its grip just enough to remind everyone that winter was not a single event, but a season with patience. Snow no longer fell in blinding sheets, yet the cold deepened, settling into wood and bone alike. Walter Hayes felt the change immediately. The air inside the cabin stayed warm, but the heat now carried weight, as if every log burned had a consequence that lingered longer than the flame. He rose before dawn again, moving carefully, joints stiff but obedient, and climbed the ladder to the hatch. The stack above had thinned further. He ran his hand along the remaining logs, counting by touch, by memory, by the quiet discipline learned long before Spokane ever knew his name. Shadow waited below, eyes following every movement, body angled toward the ladder as if his presence alone could anchor Walter to the earth. Word had spread through the ridge and down into town. Walter Hayes did not give wood away. He traded. At first, that truth offended people. It clashed with the desperate hope that survival might come cheaply, that someone else's preparation could replace their own. But desperation has a way of sanding pride down to its edges. People began to arrive not with empty hands and pleading voices, but with bundles, crates, tools, and a willingness to work. Walter accepted only what could burn, repair, or sustain. He did not haggle. He did not apologize. He explained once, clearly, and never again. "Winter doesn't accept apologies," he said, "only readiness." By the second week of January, the ridge looked different. Smoke rose not only from Walter's chimney, but from several others nearby, thinner, weaker, but present. Men and women rotated through Walter's yard, splitting donated planks, breaking down old doors, dismantling sheds that would not survive another snowfall. Among them was a man named Henry Pike, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a stoop that came from years spent bent over drafting tables rather than manual labor. Henry had been an engineer once, laid off when a firm closed. His confidence eroded slowly by rejection letters and long silences. His hair was silver, neatly combed despite the cold, his hands soft but willing. He worked methodically, asking questions, observing Walter's techniques, absorbing lessons he wished he had remembered earlier in life. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried respect rather than doubt. Sarah Collins returned often now, not as an observer, but as a coordinator. Her tall, slender frame moved quickly despite the cold, her pale skin flushed from wind and effort. She kept her brown hair braided tightly these days, practicality overtaking habit, and her eyes held a steadiness Walter had not noticed before. She organized lists, noted who needed medicine, who had young children, who had already burned too much of their homes to stay warm. Sarah had never thought of herself as brave. She had simply learned, through years of teaching children who carried their own quiet burdens, that order could be a form of mercy. Walter trusted her judgment without ever saying so. When she spoke, he listened. Rick Dalton came back again, but this time without bluster. He looked different now. The cold had carved deeper lines into his face, and the arrogance that once stiffened his posture had given way to something closer to humility. He carried a bundle of thick beams cut from the remains of his own shed, shoulders bowed beneath their weight. "I didn't get it," Rick said, setting them down. "I thought being tough was enough." Walter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It rarely is," he replied. Rick stayed longer that day, splitting wood until his hands bled through his gloves, Shadow watching him with quiet, unblinking scrutiny. But even as work continued, Walter felt the truth pressing closer. The pile above shrank faster than he liked. Each trade, each shared flame, carried a cost that numbers could not soften. Late one night, long after the others had gone, Walter climbed the ladder again, lantern swinging gently from his wrist. The wind had returned, not roaring, but persistent, a low, constant pressure that tested balance and nerve alike. Snow crusted the rungs, turning each step into a negotiation. Shadow followed to the base, barking sharply when Walter's boot slipped. Walter's heart kicked hard once, then steadied. He clipped the safety rope around his waist, anchored it to a beam, and continued upward. At the hatch, he paused. Inside, the remaining logs lay stacked neatly, fewer than he wanted to admit. He reached for one and felt the rope tug suddenly, His foot slid, body tilting into open air. For a fraction of a second, gravity took control. Then the rope went taut, biting into his side, stopping the fall just as Shadow's bark split the night. The dog lunged against the ladder, teeth clamped around the rope's loose end, pulling back with a strength that surprised even Walter. He braced himself, breath coming hard, and found his footing again. When he climbed down, his hands shook, not from fear, but from the delayed realization of how thin the margin had become. He knelt and pressed his forehead to Shadow's, whispering a wordless thanks into the dog's fur. Shadow accepted it without ceremony, tail wagging once before settling again. The next morning, Walter made a decision he had been avoiding. He gathered those who had been working most consistently. Sarah, Henry Pike, Rick Dalton, and two others whose names mattered less than their commitment. He spoke plainly. "The wood is not endless," he said. "We finish splitting what we have today. After that, we conserve. Fires smaller, nights colder. This storm isn't done, and neither is winter." No one argued. They had seen enough to understand that preparation was not a feeling, but a series of choices made before comfort demanded them. That evening, as the light faded early and the temperature dropped again, Walter sat alone at the table, repairing a glove with slow, deliberate stitches. Shadow lay nearby, eyes half closed, one ear angled toward the door. Outside, the ridge was quiet, the kind of quiet that followed hard truth rather than peace. Once more, Walter looked up at the ceiling, at the space that held what remained of his advantage, and felt neither pride nor regret. He felt responsibility, heavy and exacting. He had built the shed to survive winter, but winter had turned it into something else entirely. A measure of who was willing to prepare, and who would learn too late. Spring did not arrive in Spokane with warmth or celebration. It arrived cautiously, as if unsure whether it would be welcomed back. The snow receded inch by inch, revealing what the winter had taken and what it had spared. Roofs lay partially collapsed beneath warped beams, lean-tos sagged like tired animals, and piles of firewood, once stacked with pride, had rotted into dark, useless heaps. Along the northern ridge, however, one structure stood unchanged. The wooden storage Walter Hayes had built above his roof remained upright, dry, and intact, its angled sides still shedding meltwater with quiet efficiency. When the first supply trucks reached town, tires grinding through slush, people gathered not in laughter but in silence, watching officials from the county inspect damage and take notes. They asked questions now, not mocking ones, but practical ones. How high was the storage? How was it sealed? How much wood could it hold? Walter answered only when spoken to, his voice steady, his posture unchanged beneath the red and black flannel jacket that had become as much a symbol as the structure itself. Walter did not attend the small meeting held at the town hall that followed. He was not invited as an attraction, and he would not have come if he were. He spent that day doing what he always did, splitting wood, stacking it neatly, preparing for a season that no longer threatened but would return in time. Shadow lay nearby, his muzzle whiter than it had been even months earlier, his movements slower, more deliberate. The dog rose only when necessary, joints stiff but reliable, and settled again beneath the ladder whenever Walter climbed. There was a comfort in that routine, a rhythm that did not depend on approval or recognition. Shadow's eyes followed Walter with the same calm vigilance they always had, and when Walter rested a hand on the dog's head, the gesture carried more gratitude than words ever could. Sarah Collins visited less frequently now, though she still stopped by when the path allowed. Her appearance had changed subtly over the winter. The lines of worry that once lived around her eyes had softened, replaced by a steadiness that came from seeing order survive chaos. She wore her hair shorter now, practical and neat, the brown cut just above her shoulders. Her pale skin bore the marks of long days spent helping others, windburn and sun mixing in uneven patches. She spoke to Walter about plans the school board discussed: emergency supply lists, community work rotations, winter preparedness meetings that would begin before the first frost next year. Walter listened without comment, nodding once. Sarah understood that his silence was not dismissal. It was agreement. Rick Dalton passed by one afternoon, carrying lumber across his shoulder, his broad frame moving with less arrogance than it once had. He had trimmed his beard close, the sharp angles of his face more visible now, and there was a cautious respect in his expression when he greeted Walter. Rick had rebuilt his shed differently this time, elevating the floor, sealing the sides, angling the roof. He did not ask Walter to inspect it. He didn't need to. He had learned to measure his own work against the memory of cold nights and quieter fears. Henry Pike sent word through Sarah that he had accepted a drafting contract with the county, helping design standardized rooftop storage plans for older homes. Henry's careful nature, once dismissed as hesitation, had found its purpose at last. As April stretched into May, the ridge grew greener. Meltwater ran clear down the slopes, and birds returned cautiously, testing branches stripped bare by ice. Walter repaired what the winter had taken from his own cabin without hurry. He replaced boards he had burned, reinforced corners weakened by cold, and left the rooftop structure exactly as it was. There was no urge to improve it further. It had already proven its worth. When a reporter from a regional paper attempted to visit, camera in hand, Walter declined politely. "I didn't build it to be seen," he said. "I built it to work." The reporter left empty-handed, though not disappointed. The story had already written itself across the ridge. The following autumn arrived quietly, without warning storms or dramatic shifts. But something in Spokane had changed. Before the first snowfall, new shapes appeared on rooftops across the hills. Wooden enclosures, angled roofs, sealed hatches. Some were rough, others refined, but all followed the same principle. Firewood rose above ground level, above drifting snow, above the reach of moisture and neglect. No one laughed this time. Children asked questions. Adults answered them carefully. The phrase "Walter's way" passed from mouth to mouth, not as praise but as shorthand for preparation, done early and without spectacle. Walter noticed Shadow slowing more with each passing month. The dog slept longer, rose more stiffly, and sometimes stopped halfway to the ladder before turning back. Walter adjusted without comment. He climbed more slowly, rested more often, spoke more to the dog than he ever had before. One evening, as the first snow of the new season dusted the ridge lightly, Walter sat on the step with Shadow beside him, watching the flakes settle. "We did all right," Walter said softly. Shadow's tail thumped once, a small sound in the growing quiet. When winter returned in earnest, it found Spokane different than before. Fires burned more steadily. Panic came less quickly. People still struggled, but fewer suffered. The rooftops told the story from a distance, rows of prepared homes standing ready against the cold. Walter continued his routine unchanged, splitting wood, stacking it carefully above his head. He did not give speeches. He did not accept thanks. He lived as he always had, guided by a lesson learned long before Spokane ever knew his name. Winter did not require belief or hope or trust. It required readiness. And readiness, once learned, did not fade with the snow. Sometimes the miracle is not fire falling from the sky or walls parting before our eyes. Sometimes the miracle is quieter, a warning placed gently in a man's heart, a lesson learned long before it is needed, a hand guided to prepare when others are still laughing. If God moves in the world, He does not always do it with thunder. Sometimes He moves through wisdom earned in pain, through discipline shaped by hardship, through a decision to act before the storm arrives. Walter did not pray for the winter to be easy. He prepared for it to be honest. And in that preparation, lives were spared. That, too, is grace. In our own lives, we wait for signs, for rescue, for things to suddenly become easier. But perhaps the blessing comes earlier, in the nudge to plan, to care, to build quietly while no one is watching. Faith is not only believing God will protect us. Faith is listening when He teaches us how to protect one another. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of someone who prepares, who endures, who stands quietly when others doubt, share it with them. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or what lesson this story spoke into your life. And if you believe stories like this still matter in a loud world, consider subscribing to the channel so more people can find them. May God bless you, keep you safe through every storm you face, and grant you the wisdom to prepare before the cold arrives. Amen.